All right, welcome back for this sixth lesson of Should Christians Go to War? A look at the early Christian attitude to war. We're talking about we're continuing in the same topic that we left off before. We talked about Jesus being peaceful and gentle. We talked about him not using violence. He's teaching his disciples to live the same way, to follow these principles of love and non-resistance. We saw that the early church held very tightly to those principles, right? They strongly disapproved of war. They saw themselves as people of peace. We'll go through that again, and as we get down to the final section. But tonight we're going to continue looking at the ways they accepted war. Right now, we looked at some of those last time. We talked about things like military metaphors and the wars of the Old Testament, the apocalyptic wars, the Jewish war, things like that. But tonight we're going to look at particularly two things: the Christian experience of good in the character of soldiers. Right? We looked on the other side at their experience of evil in the character of soldiers, but now we're going to look at some good experiences that they had. And then we'll talk particularly about actual Christian participation in war, okay, and what kind of things we can see in the historical record. So if we go back through the New Testament and we look at these early writers, we can see a lot of accounts of soldiers who treated Christians with kindness, right? There were some that were very harsh and rude and mocking, but others were completely the opposite, right? They even acted with faith and respect and made a good impression on the Christians that were around them. Right? So we could go back to the soldiers that came to John the Baptist. Now, this is not exactly, these aren't Christians per se, right? This is a little before that. But these are guys that John tells them don't extort people, right? They seem to be coming with good intentions. They wanted to repent like everyone else and know what they needed to do. And John tells them, just be content with your pay. Don't extort people for money. All right, so those are some soldiers that would probably go on to be kind and at least fair with people. Then, of course, when we come into the Christian time period and interacting with Jesus, we get to the centurion at Capernaum, right? And this was a guy that had built the synagogue for the Jews, right? So even though he's a member of the Roman military, and he's an enemy and kind of an oppressor for some of these people that would normally not like him, he's been very kind to them and helped them in their city and in their religion. So they're going to have a good opinion of him, right? They're talking to Jesus and trying to convince Jesus to help them because of the goodness of this man. Then, of course, there's the centurion at the cross, the one that says, wow, surely this was the Son of God, right? He saw something in Jesus that was unique. So we don't know what happened to that guy in his story as we go on, right? But he's definitely a guy that might have been good to the Christians, even though he was one of the ones that crucified Christ. Then we see Cornelius, right? And that's in Acts chapter 10, where Peter has gone to him. The Holy Spirit sends him out there, and he becomes a Christian. And so this conversion of Cornelius and the soldiers, maybe a few of them that were in his household, is a really big deal, right? Now, of course, we don't know what happens to any of these guys, right? We don't have any history of whether they continued in the army or not, but we do see them, and they were respected by the Christians. Then there's Sergius Paulus, the proconsul of Cyprus. He's the guy that Paul speaks to when they're there. We have the interaction with Simon Magus, or Elymas, the sorcerer there. Paul blinds him. And it says about Sergius Paulus that he listened to Paul and believed what he said. So there's a good relationship there with Paul. Then there's the man who led James to the judgment seat. There's a story in, I believe it's Clement of Alexandria, It's recorded by Eusebius, and he talks about this time where, remember, James is being executed in the book of Acts, right? And so it says that when the soldier that was escorting him along, James is talking to them, they're talking with each other, and so when it came time to execute, and James is making his confession that he's a Christian and all this, the soldier said, well, I'm also a Christian, right? He had converted by James's example, right? And so as they're going off to both be executed now together, he's talking with James and asking James to forgive him, and says that James kind of thought about it a little bit and just told him, peace be with you, and then they're both beheaded. So, I mean, we don't see that story in the Bible itself. It's kind of a story that was passed down along the side, but that's a soldier that, he was supposed to be arresting James and taking him to his death, but he changed sides and went with him, right? Now, obviously, in this particular instance, that guy didn't stay in the army. He didn't go on to do anything. He gave his life as a Christian. There's some question, he wasn't baptized or anything. That's a difficulty. But we can see his faith there and his reaction. Then there's also the jailer at Philippi, right? We talked about him. He would be in the military. In the Roman military, and he was responsible for imprisoning these guys, possibly torturing them, yet he became a Christian. Again, we don't know what happened to him, but Paul had taught him and cared for him. Paul definitely didn't want him to kill himself, and wanted him to become a Christian and go on. Then there's the soldiers that cared for Paul, right? You get to him being imprisoned in all these different places, him going all around. There's the centurion Julius that was escorting him to Rome from Caesarea on the ship. There's all these things going on where, Julius saved Paul's life because the other people wanted to put him to death. They wanted to put all the prisoners to death so they couldn't escape. But Julius stood up for Paul and kept him alive, and Paul, on his term, kept them alive, or rather, the Bible says that God had basically given them all into Paul's hand to, that they would be protected because they're with him. Then there's accounts of soldiers imprisoning the apostles. Again, these are not biblical accounts. What we see in the Bible is, doesn't mention anything about that. Either way, really. But in the later stories, as the apostles are going out and they're being imprisoned, and they have some good experiences, and some of the soldiers actually convert to Christianity, right? So then there's other instances of Christians when they're being led to death. They're defending the maidens from insults, right? So these Christian ladies are being put to death for whatever reason. For whatever, argument of the government or whatever it is, but all the crowd is mocking them and jeering at them, and the soldiers are trying to fend them off and show that, these are good ladies, right? Now the soldiers are just doing their job, right, in leading them along and executing them, but for the most part, they're doing something nice here, at least in the meantime. Then there's all sorts of instances of Christians being given special privileges because the soldiers are being kind to them, allowing their friends to visit, allowing them to buy things. There's even instructions in the Didaskalia that says, to provide these things, to give money to the, not so much a bribe, but to send money to Christians that can receive these things, right? When there's opportunity in these prisons. Then, of course, there's many stories of soldiers becoming Christians because they saw the gentle, loving nature of the people that they're persecuting. I think I've mentioned it before, there's one woman who's a sentenced to have burning oil poured on her from her feet all the way up to her head. And the guy that's tasked with doing that, I mean, you can imagine if you're a soldier, you're used to fighting these terrible guys, dealing with terrible criminals. You know, you've done some terrible things in your life, but you've always thought it was for a good cause. But here you're tasked with basically, you know, killing this beautiful, kind young woman, right? And in a really horrible way. And she's just almost apologetic, right? She's very kind to you. She's not screaming out. She's not doing this. And so these guys in these stories, they did their job. Some of them stopped and they couldn't. They just were converted by the thing. Others did it and then were filled with remorse and came back and repented later. And so we see them, many of them being promptly martyred when they won't do their job. And they claim to be Christians as well. Some of them are thrown into prison, and then later the church will come and pray with them and baptize them, and then they're put to death. So these are things that were happening in the early centuries all across the Roman Empire. And so there's a lot of that sentiment, right? On the one hand, we have soldiers doing terrible things, but on the other hand, we've got Christians seeing these soldiers that are doing good. They're defending people. They're helping people. They're showing kindness. So it's not that people in the military are just all evil and bad. It's not the case at all, right? Many of them are brave and caring people, but there's two sides of the coin. Then we have Christian participation in military service, right? Christians themselves actually being in the military. So when we look at the New Testament, we do have a few examples, right? But like we mentioned, the converts of John the Baptist, right? Those soldiers that were coming to him, the centurion at Capernaum, the centurion at the cross, these are not disciples of Jesus, right? So we can't really count them for on the Christian side. We don't know what they decided in the end for their faith. If we get into the book of Acts, we get Sergius Paulus. Like we said, he believed Paul, but that's all it says, right? He doesn't quite seem to be a full convert to Christianity in the regular sense. It doesn't mention his baptism. It doesn't mention them continuing on there. So there's some question as to what happened there with Sergius Paulus. Again, we don't have enough information. And then we've got the man who led James to his execution that we told the story about. He was martyred very quickly, so he didn't really have time to make a decision whether he would stay in the army or not, right? He obviously was not going to do his duty that he had before, and so he didn't have to make that decision. So we get to Cornelius, possibly a few soldiers that were with him, and then the jailer in Philippi. These are the only cases, just a handful of cases of real Christians in New Testament times, right? There could have been more, right? But we don't know. And even with these guys, we don't know what they did. We don't know if they got out right away. We don't know if they continued on in their job for a certain time. We can only kind of look back and guess based on the writings of the later Christians and the writings of the New Testament. Now, we've mentioned this, that the New Testament and the early Christian writings, they don't say anywhere inside that, these men should not continue on in the service. It seems to be assuming that you could assume, I guess, that they did continue, right? But we don't know, right? The New Testament and the early Christian writings for the first 100 years, they don't really say anything about the military calling at all, right? Not in general. I mean, there's specific things that we talked about regarding loving your enemies and, those ideas of peace and things, but that's not directed at soldiers, right? That's not talking about these particular things. That was a very kind of edge case, you might say, in the early days. But those cases do show that from the very earliest times of Christianity, there were and could be more soldier converts in the church, right? These are guys that were soldiers and they became Christians what did they do, right? We have to think about that, right? How did they go? Did they get out of the army? Could they get out of the army? Some of the cases we know did result in martyrdom. These guys, when they announced their Christianity, but it was kind of in a public situation where people were being executed. What happened to the regular guys that just did it, kind of when no one was really watching, right? What did they do? We might be able to learn a few things from the accounts of Tertullian and others. But there's a fact that from the time of the New Testament in Acts until about 170 AD, we don't have any trace of any Christian soldiers existing in that time, right? Now we know some of them had to be there, right? Because there are some about 170, 175, right? And we assume they didn't just pop up magically there at that point. But they did exist. So, but we don't have any records, right? So this is the earliest date that we can get to. And when we get to about 174, this is the time of Marcus Aurelius, who was a very kind of interesting emperor. He was kind of this philosopher emperor. He wrote a book called Meditations. It's kind of interesting, but he also persecuted Christians. Not as much as some of his predecessors, but he did do that, and not completely, of course. But there was this story of the Legio Fulminata. That's the thunderstruck legion. And it's a story that's told by a number of people. It's recorded in Eusebius. It's told by Tertullian. It's recorded in all sorts of pagan sources. There's a monument built to Marcus Aurelius. It's on his coins. There's some Roman historians like Cassius Dio wrote about it. Now, in the pagan sources, there's no reference to Christians, right? But in the sources that we have, like Eusebius almost seems to imply that the whole legion of soldiers was Christians. But he also gets the name of the legion wrong. So he's not quite reliable in that regard. And he doesn't outright say that they're all there, that they're all Christians, but he does say that they bowed down and prayed and it rained, right? And that's the story. They're fighting up in Germany. They're going to fight against these barbarian German hordes or whatever. And it hadn't rained for a long time. The soldiers were dying of thirst. And so they prayed, and then there's rainstorm came, and the lightning and everything scared away the Germans, and the army was able to get something to drink and survive, right? Now, again, it's recorded in all these different sources, right? And everyone's taking credit for it, right? There was a group of guys there. I think it's Cassius Dio, the Roman historian, that says it was an Egyptian magician that was responsible for the rain. Some give credit to Marcus Aurelius and his prayers. Some give credit to the prayers of the soldiers there. The Christians take credit for it as their prayers. There are some accounts that there was just a crowd of Christians that were praying. We don't know if they were actually soldiers or not, right? But Tertullian talks about it as Christians that were fighting for Marcus Aurelius were here in this thing. So we don't know how many it was. If there were just a few, a handful, but they must have been soldiers for a while because they've been part of this campaign of Marcus Aurelius going around, right? Now, and that's the earliest reference that we have. Now you could say it's often said that these men were not criticized for their position by their fellow Christians, right? They're in the army, so it must be fine. Well, we don't know that their other Christians weren't saying, hey, you should really get out, right? We don't know what they were doing in the army, right? What measures they were taking to avoid, violating their principles, right? We don't know how actually dedicated they were to Christianity, but we do know that the pagan Celsus, when he writes, he's very disapproving of Christians. because they object to military service, right? And then Celsus wrote maybe around 180, I think, just a few years after this. So even though we see a few examples of people in military service, Christians in the military, the general opinion of the population is that Christians don't fight in the military, right? And so the pagans are saying, you should be helping us out. Why aren't you doing this? And the Christians are saying, well, because we have a different purpose, right? And when you think about how the church's position changed later on, in the 400s and later, where you had to be a Christian to serve in the army, you can see that they might go back and destroy some of the earlier records of strictness that were, saying that this shouldn't be done. I don't know. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. But it's hard to say that, oh, no one said anything about it. That's, again, just an argument from silence. Then if we fast forward a little bit to about 195, we get Julius Africanus. He was kind of an interesting Christian writer, historian. He served as a soldier about that time. Now again, see, this is 195, so this is about 20 years after the Legio Fulminata. But he wrote an encyclopedia that has a lot of weird stuff in it, right? It talks about, it's got instructions for how to poison food, how to poison people's wine or their wells, or even the air. It's got a section about aphrodisiac secrets. There's all kinds of obscenities and cursing in it. So Julius Africanus, maybe not the best example of Christian morals that we might think of, right? So the fact that he was serving in the army, maybe not too surprising, considering he also gave instructions for how to poison people. That's a little much, maybe. But when we get to Clement of Alexandria, again, this is the early 200s. He's talking to people who have soldiers who the gospel has come to them. They've come to faith while they're still soldiers, and he tells them, listen to what the heavenly general who orders what is righteous, right? Listen to God, right? He never says in his writings there that Christians should get out of the army, right? But he does say, you're a soldier, you need to listen to God. So, as far as it's possible to obey Christ as a soldier, then you can do that, right? But is that going to be easy? Yeah. Are you going to be able to be an effective soldier? Maybe not, right? And then there's several stories there of soldiers converting to Christianity while doing the horrible work of persecution. I think we mentioned some of those. But again, these guys are martyred usually so quickly that we don't know how many would have continued in the army or did continue in the army. That's just not something that we can make any conclusions about. Now, we said about 170, 174 is the earliest that we see Christians in the army outside of the New Testament, right? But they're already there. We don't know whether they were all converted and stayed in the army, or if there were any Christians that became Christians and then joined the army. It's not until the time of Tertullian, which is around 200, that we see the first evidence of Christians joining the army after becoming Christians, right? Well, I guess we should just say that the first evidence of Christians joining the army. Everybody before that may well have already been there, right, and converted. And that would have, of course, been the more normal case. Tertullian talks about that as being the kind of the main way that it happens. But again, he also talks about the persecution that they suffered. Tertullian actually writes a whole booklet, a whole paper on the military crown, right? Because there's a story of, it's not a story, it's a situation that happened while he was alive, that this group of soldiers, they're all wearing their laurel crowns, right? Because they've won a victory or something. But there's one guy in the group that's just carrying it in his hand, right? And so he stands out from everybody else. And it's a Christian. They take him to the commander or whatever, and they ask him, why aren't you wearing your crown? He says, well, it's not lawful for us to wear this crown because we're Christians. Right? So I don't know what he was doing in the army in the first place, what he thought was lawful in the army, how he was continuing on with that, but somehow he's got this crown and he won't wear it. And so Tertullian's trying to go through and prove that Christians shouldn't be wearing crowns. And he's got a lot of reasoning there. But he gets so far down, and he says, but we need to stop for a minute and ask if it's lawful for a Christian to even be in the military at all. Right? And he has a whole section there, which I talked about some of it before. But he gets in there, and in that discussion, he talks about the idea of taking your name from the camp of light and putting it into the camp of darkness. That's not allowed, right? But this situation of being a soldier and becoming a Christian afterwards, well, then you've got to make your way. You've got to make all these difficult choices every day and avoid the idolatry and avoid the bloodshed. And maybe you end up persecuted, right? Because this guy that wouldn't wear the crown, he started getting persecuted by his fellow soldiers, persecuted by Christians even, because he's getting Christians in trouble because he's not wearing the crown, right? And he's drawing attention to them and things like that. So there was a lot of stuff going on at that time in the middle of the 3rd century. We get this thought by Harnack, who was the German scholar that researched a lot of these things, wrote a book called The Christian Militia. And he says the number of Christian officers and soldiers gradually increased after the Edict of Toleration, around 260, so much so that the military authorities made allowance for Christianity. They looked on quietly while Christian officers made the sign of the cross at the sacrifices. Moreover, they dispensed silently with their attendance at these sacrifices. So, as time goes by, the military starts accepting Christians more and more, right? More Christians are accepting the military, and the military is accepting more Christians, making allowances for them, and saying, well, maybe you guys don't need to come to this sacrifice at all, right? And so it's slowly, the number of Christians in the military is growing because, well, that's one less thing they have to worry about. If they don't have to do this idolatry at all, then, maybe I can get in, I can get paid, I can see the world. Maybe they have to fight? Well, it depends, right? A lot of time in the military is just sitting around waiting, right? But we see the number of Christians growing after about 260. By the time we get to 295, right? So we're now 250 years at least after Jesus. We get this Christian soldier being questioned. He's on trial because he's not going to serve. He's not going to fight, right? And the proconsul asks him, look, in the sacred retinue of our lords Diocletianus and Maximinus and Constantius and Maximus, they're Christian soldiers and they serve just like this, right? So here we've got a Christian that's saying, I can't do that. And the proconsul is saying, but look, there's other Christians that are doing that, right? They're in all these different groups. There's a lot of Christians that are doing that. Why can't you do that, right? And so we got, kind of two questions there. There's the guy that's saying he can't do that, right? But then there's others that think it's okay. So maybe not unlike the position today, right? That there are a lot of Christians that think it's acceptable and some that do not, right? So where does the idea come from? Well, but it's evidence that there are Christians at that time period serving in various divisions of the Roman army under various emperors. And then we get to 303, we get the Emperor Galerius. He starts to use abuse and threats to get Christians that are in the army to desert their faith, right? So there was this Edict of Toleration back in 260, right? We saw that some of the sacrifices are being done away with, but again, not all the Roman army was on board with that. And so a new emperor comes around, and he doesn't want these Christians doing this. The persecution starts to rise up again. All right. Then go back a little bit to 299. The general Viturius attempted to purge his troops of Christian soldiers. So you can imagine if this persecution is starting to come up. We've got Christians. We want to get them out, right? Well, why do they want them out, right? What is it that's objectionable about having Christians in the army? I mean, it could just be that they don't worship the gods. They don't worship the emperor. They don't get along with everybody else because they have some different customs. Maybe in some ways it's because they won't fight. I don't know. There are clear instances of Christians fighting, but notice that most of these guys retired, right? They were allowed to retire to the service, but some of them were put to death, right? And there's something you got to consider here, right? When you try to get rid of all your soldiers in your army, if you want to get rid of all the Christians, well, the Christians can't be very big, right? You're not going to get rid of 20% of your army just because you don't like what they believe, right? They're bodies and they're fighting. If they're faithful soldiers, well, you're going to keep them in, right? You're not going to deprive yourself of a great number of your military force. But around 300, there's all this stuff going on, right? This persecution is starting to rise up, and Christian soldiers become some of the first victims. We get a soldier named Julius asking the judge why he was on trial. He said, look, in 27 years I've been serving. I never came before the judge. I've gone on 7 campaigns. He says, I never stood behind anybody. I fought as well as anybody. So again, we see a couple of things there, right? This guy is putting himself forward as a model soldier. He's brave. He's not afraid. His religion or whatever is not getting in the way. And so why is he suddenly being condemned? That might imply that there are other Christians that have been standing behind people and not fighting as well as everybody else, right? That have been trying to avoid going out on campaigns. I don't know. But you can see that this guy is a great example of a great soldier in 302, yet he's still being persecuted as a Christian. Then we've got the Christians of Armenia rising up against the Emperor Maximus Daza. He's trying to force them to abandon their faith, and so they, have a bit of a rebellion, so that he can't force them to do that. Quite a different idea than previous times, but that's what they did. Then we've got the Battle of Milvian Bridge, right? This is the time when Constantine is coming in and fighting, and where he really rises to prominence. And so it says that the Constantinian troops actually bore in that battle the sign of the cross on their shields and on their standards, their battle flags, right? They took part in the bloodshed of the battle, and they doubtless joined their leader's confident boast that he had conquered by virtue of that same sign, right? Constantine said, oh, we won because of the sign of the cross, right? It was with us. The sign of the Christ. So that's quite a testimony, right? But again, this is almost 300 years after Jesus. But we've got a lot of battles after that are always kind of pictured as struggles between Christianity and paganism, right? Constantine was the Christian emperor, even though he hadn't actually become a Christian yet. He was fighting under the Christian flag, and he was supporting the Christian cause. He was going to, have this Edict of Milan to allow Christianity. And so, him fighting against the other emperors, because there was a conflict in the empire over who was really in charge, the Christians might side with him because seems like the good guy, right? So how many Christian soldiers were there? Well, we know there are clearly more soldiers in the army at the end of the 3rd century than in the middle. So 3rd century is the 200s. So we get to 295. There are quite a few soldiers, right? A lot more than there were at the beginning in Tertullian's time, where it was quite rare, right? But like we saw around 300, the emperors are trying to get the Christians out of the army, right? And so it can't really be that high. Could it be 10% of the whole army is Christian? I don't know. Are you going to just get rid of 10% of your force? Maybe even a 20th part of your military power? Is that, you got a lot of barbarian hordes to fight. There's a lot of problems on the edge of the empire. There's a lot of various groups you've got to fight infighting. It doesn't seem very likely that they're going to deprive themselves of their military strength, especially if these Christians are faithful soldiers, right? I could see if they're not very faithful soldiers that you might want to get rid of them, right? But even at that point, right? Even at this point around 300, the Christian opinion was far from unanimous on the issue of military service. We've got church orders coming out. We've got all these things happening that are forbidding it. So that is a basic summary of the Christian participation in warfare in the first 3 centuries after Christ. As we go along, it quickly gets more and more, right? Once Constantine takes over, everything changes. Not right away, but within 100 years after Constantine, the military is 100% Christian. So that's a very drastic change from the centuries before that. So let's take a little bit. We go through some points and kind of summarize what we've talked about for the last 5-6 lessons and what conclusions we can make from that. So let me bring up my other notes here. I'm just going to have me on the screen. If I can find my right paper here. There we go. So let's put everything together. From the very beginning, right, Jesus lived and taught his disciples principles of conduct that ruled out the use of all violence or injury against others. Right? Turn the other cheek. Don't resist one who is evil. Right? Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. That clearly implies that Christians should not participate in war. Right? It's pretty straightforward. And the thing is, his principles, they're really only meant for this small group of his disciples. Right? Now, it's a growing group, but it's small. And his laws are not meant for everybody in the world to accept wholeheartedly. Right? I mean, if they do, great. But it's not going to happen anytime soon. Right? It's like yeast put into the dough. The church is going to have to grow. Right? So his non-resistance teachings, right, it's not just about not violence, right? There's this positive counterpart, right? This power of love that they have in their example and their faith. And that's what Christians use to overcome sin, right? So it doesn't make them helpless in the struggle against evil, right? But actually makes us more effective. Right? Because the whole world has been using violence to restrain evil for forever, right? And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. But how much more does the Christian life stop evil, right? It stops it almost completely in our own life. Hopefully, we can stop it completely if we're really committed to it, right? By the grace of God. But how much does it overflow into the world around us? The Christians have changed the world. Now, we saw in the first couple of lessons where we're talking about the teachings of Jesus, we saw that there are a lot of attempts to kind of get around those principles, right? To say, well, we just follow the spirit and not the letter of the law, or this is just something that was meant for a certain time period. Jesus thought he was going to be coming back soon, this is just for a perfect world, and we don't live in a perfect world, so we can't do that. We saw that all of those kind of fall apart, right? Those are false assumptions, right? This is something that Jesus really gave for his people to follow until he comes back. And it's the message that's supposed to spread and take over. It's the Christian message. Now, As we looked through the history of early Christianity and we saw these writings, these guys took Jesus at his word, right? They understood all these frequent instructions on gentleness, on non-resistance in a very literal way, right? They identified themselves as the religion of peace, right? This was beating your swords into plowshares, right? Beating your spears into pruning hooks, right? Your weapons of war are becoming farming tools, right? This is the fulfillment of the prophecy in Isaiah and Micah. So Christians condemned bloodshed, right? They condemned war because of all the bloodshed and murder, you know. They showed how crazy it is that these governments and people, they'll condemn one murderer, right? But you've got a guy over here that's killed thousands of people, and you honor him as a god, or you say, yeah, he's gone to heaven, but this guy can't ever go, right? It doesn't make any sense. He showed that it was the Christian policy to always return good for evil, right? To conquer evil with good. That's what Paul told us in Romans, right? This is Jesus's idea of loving your enemies. Then when we consider the landscape of Christianity, right, with just one or two possible exceptions, we don't know of any soldiers in the church until the time of Marcus Aurelius, until about 160, 180 AD. And even at that time, around 180, we can tell that the normal policy of the church was to not serve in the military, right? The normal policy of Christians was to not. That's why these pagan philosophers and different guys are reproaching the church. They're getting angry at the church because, what? You guys aren't working here. You guys aren't working with us. Then you fast forward to the time of Tertullian, another 20, 30 years, and we see that it was the regular practice of soldiers that became Christians to leave the army if they could, right? But Tertullian is also the earliest record we have of Christians becoming soldiers after their conversion, right? So the main idea was that Christians would get out, but there were Christians there, having this idea of a banner in the enemy's camp, so to speak, a force of the gospel inside this dark place, right? That might be encouraging to people, but that's what happened in that time. But most people were getting out. Now, there's also the military calling wasn't just about bloodshed, though, right? Being in the Roman army, there was kind of this distrust of ambition, right? The Christians didn't want to be contaminated by idolatry, right? So that's a couple of reasons why they wouldn't want to get in the military. But I mean, when you think about what Jesus has taught us to do, right? And then what the Roman military would have you do, right? You're imprisoning people, torturing them, wounding them, killing them. You just couldn't reconcile those things, right? How do you reconcile all that pain with what Jesus is telling us to do, right? It doesn't match, right? And then in the middle of the 3rd century and early 3rd century, these church orders start getting framed and put out, right? They're saying all over the eastern part of the Roman Empire, in the Eastern Church, right? Spreading out in Africa, Ethiopia, Syria, that area, right? That if you're a magistrate or a soldier, you have to give that up before you can be baptized, right? That was the official teaching of the church for hundreds of years, right? If you were a Christian and you wanted to insist on joining the army, then you would be excommunicated, right? Those were in the church orders at that time. We've got Origen down in Alexandria. When he talks about Christian duty, he's not thinking about this limited time that Jesus is about to come back. He's taking it for granted that this is something that goes on forever, right? Jesus, whenever he comes back, sure. And he shows that Christians generally refuse to serve in the army, right? And again, this is the early 200s, mid 200s, about 240. He shows that, yes, there's idolatrous contamination, and we don't want to be a part of that, but the main difficulty is the bloodshed, right? We don't want to shed blood because that's the opposite of everything that Christ taught us, right? And he really defended that with some very powerful arguments that I don't think have ever been answered. If we go and we start thinking about, when did a Christian writer first say that it was okay to join the military? Or first say that it was a good thing to join the military, right? Because there were some, like Tertullian, he might say it's okay, but you've got to, avoid all these different things, right? But who's the first guy that says that it's a good thing to be in the military? That was Athanasius, around 350 AD, right? So we've got to get after Constantine. We've got to get halfway between Constantine and this completely new Christianized Roman Empire before someone is praising Christians being in the military or killing enemies in war, right? There were people that mentioned it before, right? Praising military for one reason or another, for their bravery or whatever, but they were always having the qualification that they're not speaking about Christians, they're speaking about a pagan military, right? That was the earlier stance, but Athanasius kind of shifted that in 350. So when we think about the change, right, and why it kind of developed like this, right? When we go back to the earliest Christians, right, they were in a position that they didn't have to think about this, right? Jews and slaves didn't serve in the army. The emperor had all the volunteers that he needed. So if you were a Christian, you weren't going to be drafted. You weren't going to be forced to do this, right? So no one has to think about it for a long time, right? There's no definite ruling, right, where it's written in stone in the scripture, right? And there was no reason for that to come down like these church orders that we see later. You don't have to write those if people aren't doing it, right? Until the problem gets so big that you say, wow, we've got to do something about this, right? So by the time you get 200 years later, where this is starting to become an issue, then there's other factors that are affecting Christian thought, right? Serving in the military is not like adultery, right? We can all say, look, Jesus said adultery is bad. The pagans say adultery is bad. Everybody says adultery is bad, right? It's not like idolatry, because idolatry, the Bible is very clearly against that. And idolatry affected everybody in society, right? That was something that, that was kind of the test of whether or not you were a Christian, if you would offer this sacrifice to an idol or not, right? That was one of the major tests. But, so that's a test that Christians all over ran into. But most of them weren't going to be running into this problem with the military, right? Because it wasn't even on their mind to join the military, right? And then there's also the fact that just, military service was bound up with the police system, right? The military and the police, they maintain law and order, right? And it wasn't quite like today where we have this kind of separation. And even today in the United States, there's getting to be this argument that, hey, our police are becoming too militarized, right? They're getting this combat riot gear stuff, all this kind of body armor. They're getting all these advanced weapons, right? Why is the police becoming more like the military, right? And that's kind of a problem for a lot of people, even not Christian people. But when you think about that, well, we want peace and order. We want law and order, so the military can't be all bad, right? Christians were also fond of speaking of the Christian life as warfare, right? We are soldiers of Christ. Let's go and fight for good, right? Now, we might be thinking of fighting against the forces of evil, right? The spiritual forces of evil. And maybe the first person that said that was thinking that, but as it gets down the line, people start not understanding what wasn't explicitly clear in the beginning, or if part of the message got left off, right? Okay, we're soldiers, we're fighting for good. And I forgot to say that it's, we're not battling against flesh and blood. Now, Paul said it, but that doesn't mean that a person 300 years later knew that. Then also, if you are studying the scriptures and you're going back in the old law, it teaches us to think very highly of these old warriors, right? David and Barak and Samson and all these guys that have fought for God's people, right? And protected them and done these things. And by the power of God did great things, right? And with God's approval and his guidance. So if we're looking up to them, why can't we do that, right? God allowed them to do that. Why not us? That's basically the argument. Also, Christians are looking ahead, right, to this great military triumph that Christ is going to come back and overthrow all the enemies in the world, right? Now, maybe you believe that's going to be a real kind of military thing with actual things happening, or you might interpret that spiritually, but still, we're looking forward to this triumph of God and the armies of good over evil, right? And then in the meantime, right, while we're waiting, well, war is something that God uses to punish evildoers, right? He's punishing these bad nations. He's doing this and that. We see that in the Old Testament. It's happening now. They saw that in the Romans defeating the Jews, right? That the Jews were being punished for rejecting Christ. And so the New Testament teaches us to think of the emperor. He's appointed by God, right? His purpose is to restrain sin, to stop wrongdoing, to maintain order, right? He's not going to be able to do that without his soldiers, right? Either as an army or as a police force. Now, the thing is, knowing all that, right? None of those things keep us, or none of those things require us from joining the army, right? We can believe all that and still say no. But Christians aren't supposed to participate in warfare. We're not supposed to take up arms and fight. You can still believe that, but it makes it difficult to just say, well, war is always bad, right? Because when you have to explain all these things, right? That people think, well, why is this a good idea? Why is that a good idea? This is why this is a 6 or 7 hour class, right? Because the teachings of Jesus are pretty clear, right? And they were interpreted very clearly for a long time, but it's hard to explain that all, right? And to work and to show, because there's a lot of history here, right, that we have to understand. So that means, right, that from the beginning of Christianity, right, Christian soldiers were a possibility, right? We see them converting. We see people in the army converting to Christianity. We see some people going in. And we know that members of the church are not always the most intelligent, right? Not that they're dumb or something, but they're often very simple people. And we think of the times, a lot of these were slaves. They weren't very well educated, right? So they're simple-minded. They're not reflecting on this very much, and they're using some kind of illogical conclusions sometimes, right? I mean, the example of the guy saying, well, John the Baptist had a leather belt, so I can be a soldier, right? Because the soldier has a leather belt. Now, see, that's not a very good argument. But that's what some of them were arguing. Now, at the same time, right, the church is growing less and less strict, right? The early church was a very tight-knit group. They were closely aligned with the teachings of Jesus. Now, we see problems going on in Corinth and all of that and these different churches, and Paul's writing to stop these things. But as the church grows and spreads out, you get more and more people, right? And the ratio of apostles to people, is changing, going down. People start becoming more and more like the world, right? They start adopting these various traditions and changing these various things. And it becomes quite a different feeling than it had before. And then you could imagine if you're a soldier, right? And you hear what Paul says, let everyone remain in the calling wherein he was called, right? Well, I was a soldier, so I should stay a soldier, right? That's what Paul said. Now, he didn't say that exactly, right? That doesn't apply to everything, right? If you're a prostitute, that doesn't mean when you become a Christian, you just stay a prostitute, right? Obviously, that would be absurd. So why does it seem reasonable when we come to Christianity? But you could understand that, if you're a soldier and you become a Christian and you think, if I try to get out of the military, I might get killed, right? I mean, there are guys being martyred all around you. Maybe you see that guy over there that didn't wear the laurel crown and he's going on trial and all this stuff and everything's happening, right? You've seen people executed or beat or mocked or whatever, and you think, I'm just going to keep a low profile here and not try to cause any problems, right? Not bring any pain on myself. So you stay in the military, right? And soldiers, after a whole lifetime of this, they get used to their duty, right? They get used to seeing these things every day, right? And, a lot of their life is actually away from a lot of that. And they've always viewed it as honorable to go in and give your life in battle and to fight for your country and to do this. So it might be very easy for them to kind of overlook some of the finer details here, right? Because they're not entirely unbiased, right? And then, of course, there's Christian toleration, right? What are you going to say to somebody, right? We often feel bad when we see somebody doing something that we don't agree with, that maybe we think very strongly about, but, well, we don't want to say, well, you need to get out of the army, right? Because we don't want to have that argument. Right? Because it's possible that they can stay in the army and they can avoid all these things and do this, right? There's a lot of things like that, right? Like you could talk about acting or something, right? You might give the advice, you probably don't want to go into acting as a Christian because you're going to get surrounded by temptation, right? There's all these bad roles and bad stories and, all sorts of stuff that goes on, right? In the community, in the drama and acting community, they're not exactly known for their morals, and if you go and you get famous and you make a lot of money, then there's all these temptations, right? So there's a lot of reasons why you don't want to go into that, right? But you can't just say it's altogether bad to be an actor, right? That's not quite obvious, right? There's some nice Christian actors, right, that make some good movies, right, that aren't objectionable, right? So you could be a soldier, you could serve in this thing, you could be a police officer, you can live in such a way that you do follow the teachings of Christ. But it's really hard, right? And so this idea of Christian toleration means that, well, we'll just tolerate that, all right? So, yeah, that's a little bit. And there's not very many of them right now, right? It's just a little bit. And besides, like we said, he's a banner in the devil's camp, right? If we can convert some more of those soldiers, imagine what we can do, right? And then there's also the fact that a lot of Christians, if you're not a soldier, this isn't even about Christians. If you're not a soldier, you don't see the horrors of war, right? Especially in that day and age, right? Now we've got, we can get on YouTube or something and we can see, these videos of different things happening all over the place. But, most people aren't going to see the horrors of war, right? They might have heard about it, right? Or they might have known somebody that's seen some bad things. But, this ignorance, you might say, well, it's okay, right? And the point of that is if you can allow one person to do that, right? If somebody can be a soldier and become a Christian and stay in the army, right? Well, then why can't I join the army, right? If he can stay in, then why can't I join, right? And if there can be one, then why can't there be a lot? Now again, the having one stay in there, he has his reasons for that, right? Because getting out might get you killed, right? He might know how to navigate to not kill anybody, to not have to torture anybody or imprison anybody, and he's just kind of making his way through, in a certain way. But not everybody knows that. They just see him in there, right? And then so somebody else decides to join, and they don't follow all the same rules, right? They don't make all the same concessions and such. And so as it grows, and you get people that are less and less actually convicted to Christian principles, right? After Constantine, when he comes in, and he's saying that he's a Christian, well, a lot of people just want to be Christian because the emperor's Christian now, right? They don't maybe know much about Christ at all, right? It's just for social or political reasons that they do that. But even after Constantine rose to power and did all this stuff, the church didn't just immediately abandon its anti-militarist leanings, right? It was still very much against that. Then we have this final quote here from Dr. Cadeau, who wrote this book, The Early Christian Attitude to War. He says, during the period when the conditions of life in the empire and church relieved all but a very few of the need of making a personal decision, with the result that the problem in its different bearings dawned on the Christian mind only fragmentarily and by slow degrees. During that period, I say, the simple-mindedness of some, the worldliness of others, and the charitable tolerance, not necessarily the approval, of the rest, were already silently determining what the result would be. The consequence was that when the triumph of Constantine suddenly called upon the church to come down definitely on one side of the fence or the other, she found that a free decision was no longer open to her. Official Christianity was now committed to the sanction of war, and a proper discussion of the problem based on its merits was impossible for centuries to come. He says it's difficult to resist the impression that the church took a false step when she abandoned her earlier and more rigorous principles. And so he finishes off his book, with this idea that when we look at all this, right? I mean, it takes a long time to go through all this. And even after that, it's a hard thing to live with, right? There are serious implications of this kind of idea on how we live. But we have to ask, is there anything different in the world today that would invalidate the early Christians' testimony against war? Right? Is there something that changed? Maybe next week we can talk some about the just war philosophy, and we can talk some about Augustine and some of his ideas and some of these later church writers. But what changed that suddenly it's okay or good for Christians to do this, right? Because we saw the testimony of Jesus, we saw the testimony of the early church. We know what's possible as a Christian, right? And what the church held to basically for 300 years. But what are we going to do about it now, right? What can we do? How can we get this message out to people? How do we change our lives? How do we change the lives of the people around us? We talk about the power of love, the power of good, right? We can't just say, well, Christians shouldn't go to war, so I'm not going to get involved in that, right? How do we continue to be this influence for good that we're talking about we need to be, right? These are all questions that we need to be thinking about. So that's the end of the lesson for today. Any thoughts or comments?